You're flying 25,000 feet above Nazi Germany. Flak shells are exploding all around you like deadly fireworks. The sound is deafening. Metal fragments are shredding through your aircraft like it's made of paper. German Messerschmitts just lit your B-17 on fire. Flames are crawling toward the fuel tanks. And inside your burning plane? 4,000 pounds of high explosive bombs. Enough firepower to level an entire city block. And they could cook off any second. Your co-pilot? Dead. Slumped over the controls. Your right arm. Shredded. Useless. Hanging like a piece of meat. And somehow, you're expected to fly this metal coffin home. With one hand. Through a sky filled with fighters that want you dead. This isn't a movie. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This actually happened. Over the skies of Europe. In 1943. And what this pilot did next didn't just save his crew. It earned him the Medal of Honor. Let me tell you exactly what happened. Before we get to the fire, the blood, and the one-handed miracle, let's rewind. Let's go back to that morning. Before everything went wrong. The date is July 28, 1943. The location is a bomber base somewhere in England. The air is cold. The fog is thick. And inside a cramped briefing room, 10 young men are learning where they're going to die today. Well, where they might die. But in 1943, flying a B-17 over Germany, might was doing a lot of heavy lifting. The target? Oscarsleben, Germany. Deep in Nazi territory. A factory complex churning out Focke-Wulf 190 fighter planes. The same fighter planes that were shooting down American bombers every single day. The brass wanted those factories destroyed. They wanted the Luftwaffe crippled. And they were willing to sacrifice young American lives to make it happen. The mission plan looked simple on paper. Fly in formation. Drop bombs. Fly home. But nothing was simple about flying into the heart of Nazi Germany in 1943. The flak guns would be waiting. Miles of anti-aircraft batteries that filled the sky with shrapnel. The fighters would be waiting. Experienced German pilots who had been shooting down bombers since the war began. And the distance? The target was so deep into Germany that the fighter escorts couldn't follow the whole way. For a critical portion of the mission, these bombers would be alone. Naked. Unprotected. Flying slow and heavy through a sky full of predators. The crew knew the odds. They'd seen friends disappear. Watched bombers spiral down in flames. Counted the empty bunks that never got filled again. But they climbed into their B-17 anyway. Why? Because that's what they signed up for. Because someone had to do it. Because their friends were doing it too. And because, in 1943, saying no wasn't really an option. Now let's talk about who was actually on this plane. Because this isn't just a story about one pilot. It's a story about 10 men whose lives depended on each other. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't called a fortress for nothing. This thing was a beast. Wingspan of over 100 feet. 4 massive engines. 13.50 caliber machine guns bristling from every direction. It was designed to fight its way through enemy territory and survive. But here's what the recruitment posters didn't tell you. The B-17 was also a death trap. No armor to speak of. Fuel tanks that turned into fireballs when hit. Thin aluminum skin that German cannons could punch through like tissue paper. And the crew? 10 men crammed into a freezing, unpressurized tube, flying at altitudes where exposed skin could freeze in seconds. Let me introduce you to the key players. The pilot. The aircraft commander. The man responsible for getting everyone home. 23 years old. Aircraft commander. The man responsible for getting everyone home. 23 years old. Barely old enough to drink, but old enough to hold 10 lives in his hands. The co-pilot. His partner. The second set of hands on the controls. Young, eager, probably nervous as hell. The bombardier. The man who actually dropped the bombs. His job was to find the target and make sure those 4,000 pounds of explosives hit something important. The navigator. The human GPS. In 1943, there was no satellite navigation. No computers. Just maps, compasses, and math. The flight engineer. The mechanic in the sky. When things broke, and things always broke, he was the one who fixed them. The radio operator. The connection to base. The guy who called for help when help was needed. And the gunners. 4 men positioned throughout the aircraft, each manning a machine gun. The ball turret gunner, crammed into a tiny sphere underneath the plane, exposed and vulnerable. The tail gunner, isolated at the back, alone with his guns and his thoughts. The waist gunners, standing at open windows, wind screaming past at 200 miles per hour. 10 men, 10 lives, 1 aircraft. And in a few hours, everything they thought they knew about survival would be tested. But before we continue with what happened that day, I need you to understand the machine they were flying. Because the B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just an airplane. It was a technological marvel. A flying weapon system that pushed the boundaries of what 1940s engineering could achieve. And understanding this machine helps you understand just how impossible their survival really was. The Boeing B-17 was born from a 1934 Army Air Corps competition. The military wanted a bomber that could fly far, carry heavy loads, and defend itself. Boeing's answer was revolutionary. They called it the Model 299. The press called it a flying fortress because of all the guns sticking out of it. The name stuck. The version flying over Germany in 1943 was the B-17F. Later, the B-17G would add even more firepower.
But the F model was what most crews flew during the bloodiest period of the air war. Let me walk you through this aircraft from nose to tail. Because every inch of it mattered. Every component played a role in keeping the crew alive. Or killing them. The nose section was made of plexiglass. Clear panels that gave the bombardier and navigator visibility. Beautiful for sightseeing. Terrible for stopping bullets. German pilots figured this out quickly. A head-on attack meant their cannon rounds would punch right through that glass and into the cockpit behind it. The bombardier sat in the very front. His primary tool was the Norden bomb sight. This device was so secret that bombardiers were required to destroy it if the aircraft went down. They took an oath to protect it with their lives. The Norden was essentially an analog computer. It calculated wind speed, altitude, airspeed, and dozens of other variables to determine exactly when to release the bombs. In theory, it could put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. In practice, things were messier. But it was still the most accurate bombing system in the world at that time. The navigator sat just behind the bombardier. His workspace was cramped. Maps covered every surface. He had a drift meter to measure wind. A compass. An octant for celestial navigation. His job was to know exactly where they were at all times. Get it wrong, and the formation could fly into a flak trap. Or miss the target entirely. Or run out of fuel over the ocean. Behind the nose section was the cockpit. 2 seats. 2 control yokes. A wall of instruments, gauges, switches, and levers. Flying a B-17 was not like flying a small plane. Everything was heavier. Dot had to fight it into submission. The control yokes were connected to cables that ran throughout the aircraft. Pull back on the yoke, and cables pulled the elevators up. Turn the yoke, and cables moved the ailerons. Push the rudder pedals, and cables moved the rudder. It was a purely mechanical system. No hydraulic boost for the main controls. Just human muscle fighting against wind resistance. This is why flying one-handed was so difficult. The forces involved were enormous. At high speeds, moving the controls required real strength. 2 pilots could share the workload. 1 pilot alone had to do everything. 1 pilot with a destroyed arm? That was supposed to be impossible. The throttle quadrant sat between the 2 pilots. 4 throttle levers, 1 for each engine. Each lever controlled the fuel flow to its engine. Push forward for more power. Pull back for less. There were also propeller controls and mixture controls. Managing 4 engines required constant attention. The flight engineer typically helped with this, but his station was behind the cockpit. In an emergency, the pilots handled everything. Behind the cockpit was the bomb bay. This was the heart of the aircraft's offensive capability. The B-17F could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs internally. On long missions like this one, the load was typically around 4,000 pounds to save fuel. The bombs hung on racks, suspended over the bomb bay doors. When the bombardier pressed his release, Electric signals opened the shackles, and gravity did the rest. But none of that worked if the bomb bay doors wouldn't open. Those doors were operated by hydraulic pressure. Lose the hydraulics, and the doors stayed shut. There was a manual backup. A hand crank that physically forced the doors open. But using it meant climbing into the bomb bay, working in a cramped space, with bombs hanging inches from your head. Now imagine doing that while the bomb bay is on fire. Imagine working that hand crank while flames lick at the bombs that could vaporize you in an instant. That's what the crew faced that day. The bomb bay also housed the aircraft's main fuel tanks. The Tokyo tanks, they were sometimes called, because they added the range needed for long missions. These tanks were located right next to the bombs. Fuel and explosives, side by side. When fires started in the bomb bay, this configuration turned deadly. The fuel fed the flames. The bombs waited to cook off. It was a race against time. Behind the bomb bay was the radio compartment. The radio operator sat here, surrounded by equipment. His primary job was communication, but he also manned a machine gun that fired upward through a hatch in the ceiling. The radios of 1943 were not like modern equipment. They were temperamental. They required constant adjustment. Frequencies drifted. Static was constant. And if the antenna was damaged, communication became nearly impossible. The waist section came next. 2 gunners stood here, one on each side of the aircraft, manning .50 caliber machine guns that stuck out through open windows. Open windows at 25,000 feet. Wind blasting through at 180 miles per hour. Temperatures of 40 below zero. The waist gunners wore multiple layers of clothing. Electric heated suits that often malfunctioned. Heavy gloves that made it hard to operate the guns. Oxygen masks that frosted over and had to be constantly cleared. They stood on a metal floor that vibrated constantly. Spent brass casings piled up around their feet. When the fighters attacked, they swung their heavy guns in wild arcs, trying to track targets moving at closing speeds of 400 miles per hour. The ball turret was mounted on the belly of the aircraft. This was the most dangerous position on the B-17. The smallest man on the crew was usually assigned here because the turret was incredibly cramped. The ball turret gunner curled up in a fetal position inside a plexiglass sphere that hung below the aircraft. 2.50 caliber machine guns were mounted on either side of him. He rotated the turret with hand controls, tracking fighters that attacked from below. He was completely exposed. The thin plexiglass offered no protection from cannon rounds. If the hydraulics failed, he couldn't rotate the turret. If the aircraft had to make an emergency landing with the landing gear up, the ball turret would be crushed against the runway. There are stories of ball turret gunners who couldn't get out. Whose turrets were jammed. Who had to stay in their spheres while the aircraft belly landed. Those stories don't have happy endings. The tail section housed the tail gunner. He sat alone at the very back of the aircraft, cut off from the rest of the crew. His only company was his twin .50 caliber machine guns and the endless sky behind him. The tail gunner had the loneliest job. When fighters attacked from behind, he was the first line of defense. And the first target. German pilots knew that killing the tail gunner opened up the aircraft's most vulnerable angle of attack. The tail section was also where the control cables ran to the rudder and elevators. Damage here could make the aircraft unflyable. When that Messerschmitt's cannon rounds tore through our B-17's tail section, they didn't just wound the gunner's position. They severed some of those critical cables. Every control input from the cockpit became mushy, unpredictable. The pilot had to fight even harder to keep the aircraft under control. Now let's talk about what was attacking them. Because the Luftwaffe in 1943 was not a force to underestimate. The Germans had been fighting and winning air battles for years. Their pilots were experienced. Their tactics were refined. Their aircraft were deadly. The Messerschmitt Bf 109WA. Nicknamed the Gustav by German pilots. The 109 was a small, nimble aircraft. A single-seat fighter designed for one purpose, killing other airplanes. It was powered by a Daimler-Benz engine that gave it excellent speed and climb performance. The 109G typically one 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns mounted above the engine. Some versions added additional cannon in pods under the wings. That 20mm cannon was particularly deadly against bombers. A few hits from those explosive shells could shred control surfaces, kill crew members, and start fires. The American .50 caliber machine guns were powerful, but they fired solid rounds. The German 20mm fired shells that exploded on impact. But the 109 had weaknesses too. Its range was limited. It couldn't escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Its ammunition supply was small. A pilot might only have enough rounds for a few firing passes before running dry. And it was vulnerable. A single .50 caliber round in the engine could bring it down. German pilots accepted these limitations because their job wasn't to survive. It was to destroy bombers. Many of them were willing to trade their lives for a B-17. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was the 109's partner. If the 109 was a rapier, the 190 was a broadsword. The 190 was a more modern design. It had a radial engine rather than the 109's inline engine. This made it more rugged. It could absorb more damage and keep flying. The standard armament was devastating, two 20mm cannons in the wing roots, two more in the outer wings, and two 13mm machine guns above the engine. 6 weapons. All firing together. The FW-190 could tear a B-17 apart in a single pass. German pilots developed specific tactics for attacking bomber formations. They didn't just charge in blindly. They analyzed, planned, and executed with precision. The head-on attack became the preferred method. A fighter would climb above the bomber formation, then dive, picking up speed. At the last moment, it would level off and come straight at the bombers' noses. This approach had several advantages. The closing speed was enormous, giving the bomber gunners only seconds to react. The bombers' forward guns had limited firing arcs and couldn't track a target coming straight on. The fighters' guns were all fixed forward, so every weapon could fire at once. And the target was the cockpit. Kill the pilots, kill the aircraft. A head-on attack was also terrifying. Watching a fighter come directly at you, guns blazing, growing from a speck to a monster in seconds. Many bomber crew members said the head-on attacks were the worst. You could see death coming and couldn't do anything about it. That's exactly what happened to our B-17. A German fighter came in from the front. His cannons hit the cockpit area. The co-pilot died instantly. The pilot's arm was destroyed. In one pass, lasting perhaps 3 seconds, the entire command structure of the aircraft was shattered. The Germans also used other tactics. The company front attack involved a line of fighters approaching the bombers in formation, all firing at once. The concentrated firepower was overwhelming. The rolling attack involved fighters approaching from different angles in sequence, giving the bomber gunners no rest. As soon as they swung to engage one fighter, another was already attacking from a different direction. Rocket attacks became common later in 1943. German fighters would stand off at a distance and launch unguided rockets into the bomber formations. The rockets were inaccurate, but they didn't need to be precise. A near miss was often enough to damage a bomber or break up the formation. And then there was the flak. The anti-aircraft artillery that turned the sky into a killing ground. Flak is short for Fliege. German anti-aircraft guns. By 1943, the Germans had built the most extensive anti-aircraft network in history. Thousands of guns. Radar-directed. Deadly accurate. The standard heavy flak gun was the 88mm. This was a versatile weapon that the Germans used for everything. Anti-aircraft. Anti-tank. Field artillery. Against bombers, it fired shells that exploded at a preset altitude, showering shrapnel in all directions. The Germans used radar to track incoming bomber formations. They calculated altitude, speed, and heading. Then they set the fuses on their shells and filled a box of sky with explosions. The bombers had to fly through it. They called it Flak Alley. They called it the Death Zone. They called it many things that can't be printed. Flying through flak was pure terror. You couldn't fight back. You couldn't evade. The formation had to stay together to maintain defensive firepower. So you flew straight and level while explosions rocked the aircraft and shrapnel tore through the fuselage. A direct hit from an 88mm shell would destroy a B-17 completely. The aircraft would simply disintegrate. But direct hits were rare. Near misses were common. And near misses were deadly enough. Shrapnel traveled at thousands of feet per second. It punched through aluminum like it wasn't there. It killed crew members. It destroyed engines. It started fires. It severed control cables. It did exactly what it did to our pilot's aircraft that day. One near miss. One burst of shrapnel. One co-pilot dead. One pilot wounded. One aircraft crippled. And 8 other men whose lives now depended on a one-armed pilot refusing to quit. Through the clouds, joining formation with dozens of other bombers. From the ground, it must have looked impressive. A stream of silver aircraft, contrails painting lines across the sky. But from inside the cockpit, it felt different. It felt small. Vulnerable. Because the pilots knew something the people on the ground didn't. Those contrails were death. Sentences. Every white line in the sky was a road map for German fighters. Here we are. Come and get us. The formation climbed higher. 20,000 feet. 23,000 feet. 25,000 feet. At that altitude, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. The air was thin. Every crew member wore an oxygen mask, breathing canned air to stay alive. If your oxygen system failed, you had about 3 minutes before you passed out. Then you'd freeze to death. Or suffocate. Or both. If your heating system failed, exposed flesh would get frostbite in minutes. The B-17 wasn't just fighting Germans. It was fighting the atmosphere itself. Let me explain what high-altitude flight was like in 1943. Because modern aircraft are pressurized and climate-controlled. You sit in comfort at 35,000 feet, sipping coffee, watching movies. In a B-17, there was no pressurization. The cabin was open to the outside air. At 25,000 feet, the air pressure is about 1/3 of sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, you lose consciousness in minutes. Your vision narrows. Your thinking becomes confused. You make mistakes. Then you die. Every crew member had an oxygen mask connected to the aircraft's central oxygen system. They breathed through rubber masks that pressed against their faces. The masks were uncomfortable. They made communication difficult. And they froze. Moisture from breathing would condense and ice up. Crew members had to constantly break the ice away from their masks to keep breathing. The cold was relentless. -40 degrees. At that temperature, metal burns exposed skin. Touch the aircraft structure with bare hands, and your skin would stick to it. Pull away, and you'd leave skin behind. The crew wore layer upon layer. Long underwear. Wool clothing. Electric heated suits that plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. Leather flight jackets. Fleece-lined boots. Heavy gloves. And still, they froze. The heating suits were unreliable. Wires broke. Connections failed. Men suffered frostbite on their faces, hands, and feet despite all the protection. The waist gunners had it worst. Their positions had open windows. 180-mile-per-hour wind blasted through constantly. Even with all their gear, they were exposed to temperatures that could kill. And they had to operate their guns with heavy gloves that reduced dexterity. They had to track fast-moving targets while their fingers went numb. The physical toll was enormous. Missions lasted 8 to 10 hours. 8 to 10 hours of cold, fear, vibration, noise, and stress. Crew members returned exhausted. Some were so depleted they could barely climb out of the aircraft. The crew settled into their positions. Gunners tested their weapons. The navigator tracked their course. The bombardier prepared his northern bomb sight. And somewhere ahead, invisible but inevitable, the Germans were waiting. The English Channel passed beneath them. Then France. Enemy territory. At first, it was quiet. Deceptively quiet. The fighter escort, P-47 Thunderbolts, flew alongside the bombers, providing protection. But the escorts had a problem. Fuel. The P-47s couldn't carry enough gas to follow the bombers all the way to Germany. At some point, they'd have to turn back. And the Germans knew exactly where that point was. Let me tell you about the escort problem. Because it was one of the defining challenges of the 1943 air war. American doctrine believed that heavy bombers could defend themselves. Mass enough aircraft together, coordinate their defensive fire, and fighters wouldn't be able to get through. That was the theory. The reality was that bombers were dying by the hundreds. The B-17's defensive armament was impressive on paper. 13.50 caliber machine guns. But guns alone weren't enough. The gunners had limited training. Many had never fired at a real target before their first combat mission. They had to track targets moving at relative speeds of 400 miles per hour or more. They had to deal with cold, fear, and oxygen deprivation. They had to fire through their own aircraft structure, being careful not to shoot off their own tail or wings. And even when they hit, the .50 caliber wasn't guaranteed to bring down a fighter. German aircraft were tough. Engine armor protected critical components. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the fire risk. A fighter could absorb multiple hits and keep fighting. Meanwhile, a single pass from a German fighter could kill the pilot, start a fire, or knock out an engine. The math didn't favor the bombers. Fighter escorts changed the equation. When American fighters were present, German pilots had to deal with them first. They couldn't simply focus on the bombers. Bomber losses dropped dramatically when escorts were present. But in 1943, no American fighter had the range to reach deep into Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of a fighter. 8.50 caliber machine guns. Rugged construction. But its internal fuel capacity was limited. It could escort bombers partway into Germany, then had to turn back or risk running out of fuel over enemy territory. The P-38 Lightning had better range, but there weren't enough of them. The P-51 Mustang would eventually solve the problem, but in mid-1943, it wasn't yet available in significant numbers. So the bombers flew the deepest penetrations alone. The escorts would take them as far as possible, then wave goodbye. The Germans called this the fighter boundary. They knew exactly where the American escorts turned back. And they waited just beyond that line, ready to pounce. The moment the escorts peeled away, everything changed. Radio chatter crackled. Bandits at 3 o'clock high. The Luftwaffe had arrived. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came screaming out of the clouds. Dozens of them. This wasn't a random patrol. This was a coordinated attack. The Germans had perfected their tactics. They knew the B-17's weaknesses. They knew where to hit. The standard attack? Come in from the front. Head on. It sounds crazy, flying directly at a bomber bristling with guns. But the Germans had figured out something important. The B-17's forward guns had limited firing arcs. A fighter coming straight at the nose could hit the cockpit before the gunners could respond. And hitting the cockpit meant killing the pilots. Killing the pilots meant a dead aircraft. The first German fighter dove. Inside the B-17, the pilot watched it coming. A dark speck growing larger. Then a nose. Wings. The flash of cannons. Tracers streaked past the cockpit like angry hornets. The co-pilot fired back. The top turret opened up. 50 caliber rounds filled the air. The German flashed past, missing by feet. But he wasn't alone. Another fighter. Then another. Then 6 more. They came in waves, slashing through the formation. Bombers started falling. To the left, a B-17 exploded. No parachutes. Behind them, another bomber spiraled down, engines burning, crew jumping into the freezing air. This was the reality of daylight bombing in 1943. This was what acceptable losses looked like from the inside. And the real fight hadn't even started yet. The formation pressed on. They had to. The target was still ahead. Bombers flew in tight boxes, each aircraft providing covering fire for its neighbors. The theory was that concentrated firepower would protect everyone. The reality? The Germans didn't care about theories. The flak started next. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground opened up. Not aiming at specific planes, there was no need. They just filled a box of sky with explosions and let the bombers fly through it. The first shells burst below the formation. Black puffs of smoke and shrapnel. Then the gunners adjusted. The bursts got closer. Inside the B-17, the crew could hear the explosions. Feel them. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage like deadly hail. A shell burst directly beside the cockpit. The explosion threw the aircraft sideways. Metal fragments punched through the thin aluminum skin. And then the pilot felt it. Pain. Immediate and overwhelming. His right arm shattered. He looked down. Blood. Bone. Torn flight suit. A piece of shrapnel had ripped through his arm, destroying muscle and tendon. His right hand was useless. He couldn't move his fingers. Could barely feel them. And the B-17? It needed 2 hands to fly. But that wasn't even the worst part. The pilot turned to his co-pilot. And everything stopped. The co-pilot was slumped forward. Blood everywhere. He wasn't moving. The same flak burst that had torn the pilot's arm had killed his partner. 1 second, the co-pilot was there. Flying the plane. Doing his job. The next second, gone. In the chaos of combat, there's no time to grieve. No time to process. The pilot had a dead man next to him, a destroyed arm, and an aircraft that was still flying 25,000 feet above Nazi Germany. And the mission wasn't over. But here's where the impossible started. Because the flak hadn't just killed the co-pilot and wounded the pilot. It had hit the aircraft. Hard. Fuel was leaking. One engine was smoking. The hydraulic lines were damaged. And somewhere in the chaos, a fire had started. Not a small fire. Not something the crew could easily contain. A fire that was spreading. Toward the bomb bay. Where 4,000 pounds of high explosives were waiting to detonate. Let's stop here for a second. Because I need you to understand the mathematics of disaster this pilot was facing. Problem number 1, his right arm was destroyed. Flying a B-17 normally required 2 hands working together. The control yoke was heavy. The rudder pedals needed coordination. One-handed flying? Technically possible. For a few minutes. In calm conditions. But these weren't calm conditions. This was combat. The aircraft was damaged. And they were still under attack. Problem number 2, the co-pilot was dead. Normally, when a pilot got hit, the co-pilot took over. But there was no co-pilot. Just a body. Problem number 3, the aircraft was on fire. And not just anywhere. The fire was moving toward the bomb bay. Now, you might be thinking, just drop the bombs. Get rid of them. Smart thinking. Point 79245. The bombardier thought the same thing. But the bomb bay doors wouldn't open. The hydraulic system was shot. And the manual release? Someone had to physically go into the bomb bay and crank the doors open by hand. While the fire was burning. While the bombs were heating up. Problem number 4, even if they solved all the other problems, they were still deep in enemy territory. Hundreds of miles from England. Surrounded by German fighters. With a crippled aircraft that was getting slower and weaker by the second. Any sane person would have bailed out. Would have ordered the crew to jump. Would have accepted that this mission was over. But this pilot wasn't thinking about survival in the abstract. He was thinking about his crew. And that changed everything. Here's what separates heroes from everyone else. It's not fearlessness. Heroes aren't fearless. They are terrified. It's the decision. The choice. The moment when every logical option says, quit, and something inside says no. The pilot made his decision. He wasn't going to bail out. He wasn't going to order his crew to jump over Germany and become prisoners of war, or worse. He was going to fly this broken, burning aircraft home. With one hand. He grabbed the control yoke with his left hand. His only working hand. The aircraft was heavy. The controls were sluggish. Every movement required effort that, normally, would be split between two arms. Now he had one. He called out orders to the crew. Get that fire out. Now. Someone get to the bomb bay. We need those doors open. Gunners, keep those fighters off us. He wasn't panicking. He was problem solving. Because panic kills. And he wasn't ready to die. Let's follow the crew for a moment. Because this wasn't a one-man show. Every single person on that aircraft was fighting for survival. The flight engineer grabbed the fire extinguisher. Inside a B-17, fire extinguishers were basic. Not like modern ones. Barely adequate for small electrical fires, let alone a spreading blaze. He fought his way toward the bomb bay, the heat intensifying with every step. The fire was licking at the bomb casings. 4,000 pounds of explosives, getting warmer by the second. Now, high-explosive bombs don't usually detonate from fire. Not immediately. But usually, doesn't mean, always. And if those bombs cooked off at the wrong moment, the entire aircraft would vaporize. The engineer sprayed the fire. White chemical foam hissing against the flames. The fire fought back. Fed by leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid. Another crew member joined him. Together, they battled the blaze, knowing that every second counted. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the fire began to retreat. But it wasn't out. Not completely. It kept trying to reignite. And outside the aircraft, the Germans weren't done. The Luftwaffe pilots saw the smoking B-17. They saw it falling behind the formation. To them, this was an easy kill. A wounded animal waiting to be finished off. 2 Messerschmitt 109s peeled off and ducked toward the crippled bomber. The tail gunner saw them coming. He swung his twin .50 calibers and opened fire. Tracers arced through the sky. The first German pulled up, rounds sparking off his engine cowling. But the second one kept coming. Cannon rounds tore through the B-17's tail section. The tail gunner kept firing, even as his position disintegrated around him. One round caught the German fighter's engine. Black smoke erupted from the cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled away, trailing smoke. Heading down. But the damage was done. The B-17's tail was shredded. Control cables were severed. The aircraft was even harder to fly now. In the cockpit, the pilot felt the controls go mushy. The tail wasn't responding properly. He compensated. Adjusted. Used his one working hand to fight the aircraft into submission. Every minute felt like an hour. And they still had hundreds of miles to go. Let me tell you what it's like to fly a crippled bomber for 200 miles. Because the movies make it look dramatic. Heroic. Maybe even a little glamorous. The reality is different. The reality is exhaustion. Pain. Fear that never goes away. The pilot's left arm was starting to cramp. The control yoke was heavy. Every turbulent bump sent jolts through his body. His right arm hung useless at his side, wrapped in a makeshift bandage made from a crew member's shirt. The blood had stopped flowing, mostly. But the arm was dead weight. Just a reminder of how fragile everything was. The aircraft was losing altitude. Slowly. Inevitably. 2 engines were struggling now. One had been feathered, shut down to prevent fire. The formation was long gone. They'd been left behind, too slow to keep up. Now they were alone. A single wounded bomber limping across occupied Europe. Every cloud could hide an enemy fighter. Every minute was borrowed time. The navigator plotted the shortest route home. Straight line across France to the English Channel. But the shortest route wasn't always the safest. German flak batteries dotted the French countryside. Radar stations tracked aircraft and vectored fighters. They had to find a balance. Short enough to survive. Safe enough to avoid more attacks. The navigator did his job. Called out course corrections. Kept them pointed toward salvation. And the pilot? He just kept flying. One-handed. 1 minute at a time. While the pilot fought the aircraft, the rest of the crew fought their own battles. The fire team was still working. The blaze had been knocked down, but hot spots kept flaring up. Every few minutes, someone would spray more extinguisher. Check the bomb casings for heat. The bombs were still aboard. Still dangerous. Still capable of ending everything in a flash of light and heat. The radio operator was trying to make contact with base. Mayday. Mayday. Aircraft damaged. Casualties aboard. Request emergency landing. The radio crackled with static. The antenna had been damaged in the attack. He kept trying. Adjusting frequencies. Hoping someone would hear. Finally, a response. Faint, but there. We read you. Emergency services alerted. What is your status? The radio operator reported everything. The dead co-pilot. The wounded pilot. The fire. The damage. The response came back, Godspeed. We'll have everything ready. They weren't alone anymore. Somewhere in England, people knew they were coming. If they made it. The French coast appeared ahead. The English Channel. Salvation. But also the most dangerous moment of the flight. Because the channel was wide. And the B-17 was low on everything, fuel, altitude, hope. If they went down in the channel, they'd freeze to death in minutes. The water was cold enough to kill in 15 minutes, even with life jackets. The pilot did the math. Remaining fuel. Distance to the English coast. Altitude loss per minute. It was going to be close. Very close. The engines were coughing now. Running rough. The damage was taking its toll. The aircraft shuddered. Dropped 50 feet. Stabilized. Come on, the pilot muttered. Just a little farther. His left arm was on fire with fatigue. His right arm was on fire with pain. But he didn't let go. The French coast passed beneath them. Blue water ahead. Endless blue water. And then, after what felt like hours, a sight that every bomber crew prayed for. The white cliffs of Dover. If you've never seen them from the air, you can't understand what they meant to a bomber crew in 1943. Those white cliffs were England. Were home. Were survival. The pilot saw them and felt something he'd been suppressing for hours, hope. Maybe. Just maybe. They were going to make it. Navigator, find me the nearest emergency field. The navigator had already done it. An airfield on the coast. Ready for emergencies. But landing was going to be its own nightmare. Landing a B-17 requires 2 hands. You need to control the yoke. Work the throttles. Adjust the trim. Handle the landing gear. All while bringing 30 tons of aircraft down gently enough not to kill everyone aboard. The pilot had one hand. His left hand. Normally, the co-pilot would handle half the workload. But the co-pilot was dead. The flight engineer stepped up. "I'll work the throttles. You tell me what you need." It wasn't elegant. It wasn't proper procedure. But it was all they had. The landing gear. That was the next problem. The hydraulics were shot. The gear had to be cranked down manually. Crew members scrambled to the manual release. Cranking. Sweating. Praying. The gear dropped. Locked into place. One problem solved. A dozen more to go. The airfield came into view. A beautiful, flat, welcoming runway. Emergency vehicles lined the strip. Fire trucks. Ambulances. Crash crews. They knew a wounded bird was coming in. The pilot lined up on final approach. His left hand was shaking from exhaustion. But he held steady. "Throttle back," he called out. The engineer pulled back on the throttle levers. The aircraft slowed. Altitude dropping. Too fast. Too slow. Finding the balance. The runway rushed toward them. The pilot fought the controls. The damaged tail section made the aircraft want to yaw to the left. He compensated. Held it straight. "Flaps," he called out. Another crew member worked the manual flap controls. The aircraft settled. Lower. Lower. The wheels touched down. Immediately, the aircraft tried to veer off the runway. The damaged brakes, the uneven tire pressure, the aerodynamic imbalance from the damage. The pilot stamped on the rudder pedals. Used everything he had to keep the aircraft straight. It worked. The B-17 rolled down the runway, slowing, settling, surviving. And then, finally, it stopped. The engines fell silent. For a moment, nobody moved. The crew sat in their positions, stunned by their own survival. Then the hatch opened, and the crash crew swarmed in. The pilot was pulled from the cockpit. Medics took one look at his arm and rushed him to an ambulance. The dead co-pilot was removed with reverence. Covered with a sheet. Carried away by men who understood the price of war. The rest of the crew climbed out one by one. Shaking. Exhausted. Alive. Mechanics looked at the B-17 and shook their heads. The aircraft was a disaster. Hundreds of holes in the fuselage. One engine dead, two damaged. The tail section hanging by threads. Fire damage throughout the bomb bay. "How did you fly this home?" someone asked. The pilot, being loaded into the ambulance, managed a weak smile. Didn't have a choice. The story didn't end on that runway. In the weeks that followed, reports were written. Testimonies gathered. Commanders learned exactly what had happened over Germany. The pilot had flown a crippled, burning aircraft for over 2 hours. With one hand. With his co-pilot dead beside him. With 4,000 pounds of bombs that could have killed everyone. He hadn't just survived. He'd saved 9 other lives. The recommendation went up the chain of command. The Medal of Honor. The highest award for valor in the United States military. Only a handful of airmen received it during World War II. It wasn't given for simply doing your job. It was given for doing the impossible. And this pilot had done exactly that. Now, you might be thinking, that's an amazing story. But what does it mean for me? Fair question. Because here's the thing about heroes, they don't think they're heroes. Ask any Medal of Honor recipient, and they'll tell you the same thing. I was just doing my job. I couldn't leave my friends. Anyone would have done the same. But that's not true. Not everyone would have done the same. Not everyone has that thing inside them, that refusal to quit, that decision to keep fighting when everything says stop. But here's what I've learned from studying these stories. That thing? It's not genetic. It's not something you're born with. It's built. The pilot didn't become a hero in the moment his arm was destroyed. He became a hero in the months of training before. In the missions that came before. In the relationships with his crew that made their lives worth saving. When the moment came, he didn't have to think. He just had to act. And that's the lesson. Heroism isn't about waiting for the dramatic moment. It's about preparing for it. It's about who you become before the crisis hits. There's one more thing I want to talk about. Because this isn't just a story about one pilot. It's a story about 10 men who trusted each other with their lives. The tail gunner who kept firing even as his position was destroyed. The flight engineer who took over the throttles without being asked. The crew members who fought the fire, inches from bombs that could have killed them. The navigator who plotted the course home. The radio operator who kept calling for help until someone answered. None of them gave up. None of them panicked. None of them said, "This is hopeless." They worked together. Trusted each other. Depended on each other. That's what saved them. Not just one hero. A crew of heroes. And that's the other lesson. You're not meant to do it alone. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Because this crew's survival was exceptional. And I mean that literally, it was an exception. During World War II, the United States Army Air Forces lost approximately 18,000 aircraft in combat over Europe. 18,000. And those aircraft weren't empty. Each one carried crews of 10 men. The total casualty figures are staggering. Over 30,000 airmen killed. Thousands more wounded or captured. Every bomber that fell from the sky was a story like this one, but with a different ending. Men who fought just as hard. Flew just as bravely. Made the same decisions. But didn't make it home. The survival rate for bomber crews was calculated in statistics that would horrify modern minds. Complete a tour of 25 missions? The odds were roughly 50 to 50. And that was after improvements in tactics and technology. Earlier in the war, the odds were worse. This pilot beat those odds. But thousands didn't. That's not to diminish his achievement. It's to put it in context. He didn't succeed because he was lucky. He succeeded because he refused to let luck be the deciding factor. Let me take a moment to talk about the aircraft itself. Because the B-17 Flying Fortress was as much a character in this story as any of the men. The Boeing B-17 entered service in 1938. By the time World War II reached its peak, thousands had been built. It was, in many ways, a miracle of engineering. For engines meant that even with one or two knocked out, the aircraft could still fly. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire, though clearly not enough. 13 machine guns provided defensive firepower that made attacking fighters pay a price. But the B-17 also had weaknesses. And the Germans exploited every one. The fuel tanks could still be ignited by incendiary rounds. The cockpit was vulnerable to head-on attacks. The bomb bay was a potential explosion waiting to happen. And most critically, the B-17 was slow. Cruising at around 180 miles per hour, it was a sitting duck for German fighters that could do twice that speed. The B-17 survived not because it was invincible, but because it was tough. It could absorb incredible punishment and keep flying. Aircraft came home with tails nearly severed. With engines shot off. With holes you could throw a football through. The crews called it the fort. And they loved it. Because when everything went wrong, the B-17 could still bring you home. If you fought hard enough. It's easy to make the Germans faceless villains in these stories. But that's not accurate. And it's not fair. The Luftwaffe pilots attacking these bombers were skilled airmen. Many had years of combat experience. They were fighting to protect their homeland. Their factories. Their cities. From their perspective, these American bombers were bringing death and destruction to German soil. The German fighter pilots had their own heroes. Their own Medal of Honor equivalents. Their own stories of courage and sacrifice. War is complicated. The men in those Messerschmitts weren't monsters. They were soldiers doing their duty, just like the Americans. That doesn't make the bombing campaign wrong. The factories being targeted were producing weapons that prolonged the war and cost lives. But it does add context. The pilot in our story wasn't fighting cartoon villains. He was fighting skilled professionals who were trying to kill him with the same determination he had to survive. That makes his achievement even more remarkable. After landing, the pilot's war was over. His arm injuries were severe. The shrapnel had damaged muscles, tendons, and nerves beyond easy repair. 1943 surgery wasn't what it is today. The arm would never fully recover. He faced months of hospital time, surgery, rehabilitation, and the psychological wounds that every combat veteran carried. He'd seen his co-pilot die inches away. He'd flown knowing that every second could be his last. That doesn't leave you unchanged. We didn't call it PTSD in 1943. We called it combat fatigue, or just pretended it didn't exist. But it was real. And every survivor carried it. The pilot received his Medal of Honor, attended ceremonies, shook hands with generals. And then he went home. To a country that didn't fully understand what he'd been through. To friends and family who couldn't comprehend what combat was really like. That's the part of the hero story that rarely gets told. The heroic moment is dramatic. The aftermath is quiet. Long, often lonely. So what do we take from this story? First, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. That pilot was terrified. Anyone would be. But he made the choice to keep flying anyway. Second, preparation matters more than heroics. Every drill, every training flight, every procedure practiced until it became automatic. That's what saved them. When the crisis hit, there was no time to think. Only to react. And the reactions had been built through months of preparation. Third, you're never alone. The pilot couldn't have done it without his crew. The crew couldn't have done it without each other. Whatever challenge you're facing, find your crew. Build your team. Trust them. Fourth, the machine matters, but the people matter more. The B-17 was tough. But without skilled, determined men inside it, that toughness meant nothing. Technology is just a tool. What you do with it is what counts. Fifth, sometimes survival is the victory. Not every mission ends with bombs on target. Sometimes just bringing everyone home is the win. Know what success looks like for your situation. Don't die chasing someone else's definition of victory. This story happened in 1943. 8 decades ago. A different world. But the core truths haven't changed. People still face impossible situations. Still have to make decisions with no good options. Still have to dig deep and find something they didn't know they had. Maybe your crisis won't involve flak and fighters. Maybe it'll be a medical diagnosis. A financial disaster. A personal tragedy. But the principles remain the same. Don't quit. Use what you have. Trust your crew. Keep moving forward. The pilot didn't have a secret superpower. He didn't have magical luck. He had training, teammates, and a refusal to give up. Those things are available to everyone. Before we finish, let's take a moment. Because one man didn't come home from this mission. The co-pilot. Killed in the same attack that wounded the pilot. His name is part of history. His family received a folded flag and a telegram. His contribution to the mission's success is often overlooked. But here's the thing, before he died, he was doing his job. Flying the aircraft. Protecting his crew. His service mattered, even if he didn't survive to receive medals. And that's true of thousands of airmen who never came home. The 8th Air Force lost more men in World War II than the entire United States Marine Corps. Let that sink in. More men died in the skies over Europe than in every beach landing, every island assault, every jungle fight the Marines endured. Most of them don't have movies made about them. Don't have books written. Don't have YouTube videos telling their stories. But they served. They fought. They died doing what they believed was right. So while we celebrate the heroes who made it home, let's remember the ones who didn't. Here's a question to sit with. If you were in that cockpit, arm destroyed, co-pilot dead, plane on fire, what would you do? Would you quit? Would you give up? Would you accept that the odds were impossible and save yourself? Nobody can answer that question honestly until they are actually there. But here's what we can do: we can practice being the kind of person who keeps going. Every small decision matters. Every time you push through when quitting would be easier, you're building something. Creating habits of perseverance. So that if, God forbid, you ever face your own impossible moment, you'll have the tools to survive it. So yeah, now you know what happened in the skies over Germany in 1943. A pilot flew a burning aircraft home with one hand. Saved 9 lives. Earned the Medal of Honor. Not because he was superhuman, but because he refused to be anything less than human. He made a choice. In the worst moment of his life, he chose to fight. That's all heroism is. A choice. Now here's my question for you. What choice are you going to make today? Not life or death. Probably not. But some choice that matters. Some moment where quitting would be easier than continuing. Make the hard choice. Build the habit. Become the person who keeps going. If this story hit different, if you want more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, there's a video right here that goes even deeper into World War II's most insane survival stories. Click it. You won't regret it. And if you made it this far, you're already the kind of person who doesn't quit. So prove me right. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.